Hello and welcome to CineMaine, where we take a look at films that are connected to Maine, whether they be set in Maine, filmed in Maine, or have any other loose connections to the state of Maine. And today we are looking at the 1979 TV movie Salem's Lot, based off of the Stephen King novel of the same name and directed by Tobe Hooper. Director of such films as Poltergeist and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. No, not that one. There you go. Though this originally aired as a two-part miniseries on CBS near the end of '79, it does run at the 3-hour mark and therefore could be watched as a movie. And to top it all off, Warner Brothers spent quite the amount of money on this compared to other made-for-TV movies of the era, hiring Tobe Hooper to direct, who had directed the then-recent horror film Texas Chainsaw Massacre, a film that became quite a cult hit and contributed to creating the slasher movie subgenre of horror. On top of that, the film's script was written by Paul Monash, the producer of Carrie, the first of many movies and shows based off of King's works. And though it only aired on TV, the film got quite the following. So much so that Warner Brothers made a sequel that actually did get a theatrical release 8 years later. What connects this film to Maine, aside from being based off of a novel from a Maine author, is of course the film's setting in the fictional town of Salem's Lot, which, like a lot of King's stories, is set in Maine. This fictional Maine town is considered to be part of a trinity of fictional Maine towns featured in King's works, the other two being Derry and Castle Rock. Geographically, Jerusalem's Lot, Salem's Lot for short, is described as being in Cumberland County, 10 miles north of Portland to be more precise. In real life, this would also place Salem's Lot between towns such as Windham and Falmouth. Despite being set in Maine, however, the movie was actually filmed in California, with a lot of indoor scenes being filmed on sound stages in Burbank and outdoor scenes being filmed in the town of Ferndale. Admittedly, I can tell just by watching this film that they didn't actually film anything in Maine. When it came to indoor scenes, such as Mark Petrie's bedroom, I could tell that scenes like this were on a soundstage due to the lack of windows, as well as the fact that the size of the room's area looks less like the size of a kid's bedroom and more like the size of a set. The outdoor scenes, despite being filmed at an actual location, don't really look like Maine to me either. Places like the park that Ben and Susan are hanging out in early on look like they could maybe be Maine, but the town itself definitely doesn't look like Maine to me at all. I look at the hills and valleys in the background and think to myself, okay, this looks more like either Colorado or Montana or one of those western states. Like I mentioned earlier, it turned out to be Northern California, which is not surprising to me. In fact, there was a scene during the climax where they stick something in the background for a few shots that looks like a lobster trap, but isn't. It's almost like the filmmakers realized nearing the end of filming that California and Maine don't actually look that similar, so they just thought, I don't know, let's put some random lobster traps in the background. That'll help it look more like Maine, right? There are also a couple of times when real Maine cities like Portland and Bangor get name dropped. One instance includes Susan Norton's actress, Bonnie Bedelia, pronouncing Bangor's name wrong.
Well, there's Bedell, the movies in Bangor.
Yeah, as I've alluded to in the past, a lot of people that aren't native Mainers think Bangor is pronounced that. I can attest that it's not. Even though the filmmakers got that wrong, they did get Maine's flag right at least. I don't know why, but for some reason I thought they'd get that detail wrong too. I'm glad that they didn't. While the majority of the film is set in Maine, the prologue and final scene, like the book, are not. In the book, the prologue and ending occur in Mexico, while in this movie, that setting is changed to Guatemala. Even though, as far as I know, these scenes were, like the rest of the movie, filmed in California. I'm not exactly sure why the setting was changed, but at this point I'm probably nitpicking. Now, as far as my overall thoughts on this movie go, I have to admit, I was surprisingly kinda underwhelmed by it. I say surprisingly because, while I'd never seen this movie before checking it out for this review, I'd certainly heard about it before. The film's poster is quite iconic, and for at least the last few years or so, I've been aware of the impact that this film has left on vampire movies and shows since its release. I've heard people talk about this film as if it were one of their favorite Stephen King adaptations, and yeah, there are definitely parts where I can see why, but having finally seen the film, I kind of felt it didn't really live up to the hype that had surrounded it. That's not to say that this film is without things I liked, though. While the head vampire in this movie, Kurt Barlow, may not get a lot of screen time, the movie does get entertaining whenever he is on screen. I can tell that the guy playing him, Reggie Nalder, must have had a lot of fun. Even though he's very different in this film compared to the book, I love the design of this creature and how it's clearly influenced by Count Orlok, aka Nosferatu. For as dated as this movie may be, I have to admit, the makeup on Barlow still looks pretty good. I've heard rumors that they had to keep reattaching makeup constantly, and that was a big influence on the decision to give Barlow significantly fewer lines than he had in the book. I don't know how true this is, but if it is true, that's actually kinda brilliant. It kinda reminds me of how the mechanical shark used for Jaws kept malfunctioning during the filming of that movie, and how, as a workaround, Spielberg decided to show the shark as rarely as possible to up the scare factor by relying on what we don't see. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Speaking of parallels to Dracula, I also like the bit of Kurt Barlow being in a crate that's being transported in a truck driven by Mike Ryerson and Ned Tebbets. I can't help but think of this truck as this story's version of the Demeter from Dracula. I also did like a lot of the scenes involving Mark Petrie. I feel like this character must have been loosely based off of what King himself was like at that age, considering some of his hobbies, along with the fact that he's quite the horror movie buff. There's one creepy scene in this film that does stand out to me specifically. It involves Mark fending off Danny Glick after he's been turned into a vampire. Danny tries flying into Mark's room through the window in an attempt to try to turn Mark into a vampire as well. Mark does a good job standing up to Danny during this scene, but you can also tell he's genuinely heartbroken by the encounter, considering that before Danny was turned into a vampire, he and Mark were good friends. I like that the movie doesn't oversimplify this experience either. It gives you a subtle enough amount of emotion to let the viewer know what Mark is going through. I'll also give credit that when the movie does actually focus on trying to set up an unsettling atmosphere during some of its quieter moments, it does feel genuinely creepy. It doesn't happen in the movie often enough, but when it does, it feels fittingly eerie. On top of that, when it comes to the film's scares, I like that there isn't an over-reliance on gore. I'm sure that's no surprise considering that this is a made-for-TV movie, but still. There's one section that comes to mind involving this dog unfortunately getting the John Wick treatment. They just do a slow pan over to the dog looking petrified for a second and then cut away. The filmmakers know the audience can fill in the blank when it comes to what happened. It's a good example of saying a lot, but with very little. There are other creepy moments as well, such as this shot of the skull being next to Straker's head, and a scene much later on in the film involving a light bulb breaking and the house shaking like mad. Even though the latter scene is kind of over the top. But it's the kind of over the top that I've come to expect from retro horror films about vampires. If anything, I kinda wish this film had more moments like this throughout. The film also has a decent musical score. Not the most memorable compared to other horror movies, but it contributes to creating an unsettling atmosphere rather effectively. Even if it does feel like it's kinda ripping off Psycho at one point. Oh, wait a minute. Apparently that's Vivaldi. No! Also, on a side note, it was a pleasant surprise to see Fred Willard in this movie. I've liked this guy in a lot of things he was in, and while his appearance here is a little hard to take seriously since it reminds me so much of his role in Anchorman, that also kinda made his scenes stand out to me a little more, even if his character did some unlikable things. Speaking of which, while I can definitely appreciate the fact that, much like the book, the movie does try taking its time to let the viewer get to know the characters, I have to be honest. I don't think this film did that good of a job of getting me interested in them. Much like the book, we get plenty of scenes in the first act with Ben Mears and Susan Norton interacting. In this particular movie, however, these characters really don't have any chemistry with one another, and I kind of felt nothing during their scenes together. Or if I did feel anything, it was that these aspects made the film feel too soap opera-ish. In fact, a lot of the first act of this movie feels like that, unfortunately. The biggest offender is this subplot during the first act involving Cully Sawyer's wife, Bonnie, cheating on him with Fred Willard's character, Larry Crockett. Not only does this subplot feel heavily like something you'd see in a televised soap opera from that era, but it just feels incredibly tacked on. I'm sure it connects to something in the main story, but it feels like you could easily just cut this out of the movie and not really miss anything. A part of me wishes it was cut, considering that this film is nearly 3 hours long. Not to mention that when Cully's getting ready to shoot Larry for catching him and Bonnie in the act, Cully's attitude seems surprisingly nonchalant. This could be creepy if this subplot were properly developed, but it's just a B story, so instead it comes off as unintentionally funny. Going back to the film's runtime though, I understand that the filmmakers' goals were to turn this into a 2-part miniseries because they wanted this film to take its time with setting up its atmosphere and characters, like the book did. The downside is that because they made so much of the first act feel soap opera-ish, it makes the film's first act, for the most part, rather forgettable and poorly paced. Even the original book didn't take this long to tell its story, and that book was over 400 pages long. Now, in this movie's defense, I will admit, I get the feeling that this movie was great for its time, but may not have aged very well. This was made when King was just getting his start as a writer. Much like how the original book was King's second publication, this was only the second time one of his works was adapted into another medium, coming out only 3 years after Carrie. So while he was starting to become a household name, he wasn't nearly as widely known or influential as he is today. So when Carrie was a big hit, many major Hollywood studios naturally tried to make their own movies based off of King's works. In order for something new to reach a wide audience, however, it has to appeal to the masses in some way and play it safe to start with. I think back to the first X-Men movie and what that did for comic book movies at the time, or more recently, the first Sonic movie and what that did for video game movies. When those films were made, the filmmakers had to make certain conventional choices to get general audiences on board, and when those movies did well, subsequent sequels in both franchises started resembling the comics and games more and more, showing that it was possible for said source material to work cinematically, and King's works are no different. Nowadays, filmmakers know that King's work all by itself won't have trouble finding an audience, but back then, he was an up-and-coming author. So similar choices were made with this film, which unfortunately for the late 70s meant making this film a bit soap opera-ish. Not only does this unfortunately cause this film to feel dated and a little stale in that regard, but compared to other Stephen King adaptations, both good and bad, this one ends up feeling not very, for lack of a better word, kingly. I may not have been the biggest fan of Pet Sematary, for example, but at least with that film, it was Stephen King basically going full King. And there was no mistaking that film for being adapted from anyone else's works. So even if I wasn't the biggest fan of it, I can still definitely see and appreciate its appeal. The only real major appeal I can see this film having is nostalgic appeal. Like, say this was one of the first Stephen King adaptations that somebody saw and they were really young when they saw it and they found it to be the creepiest and spookiest thing, and when they revisit the film when they're older, they might be a little more willing to recognize its flaws, but they still enjoy the film anyway because it reminds them of a simpler time. In which case, fair enough. There are a lot of movies that are like that for me. But as someone who is familiar with the original novel and has seen this story adapted a couple of times before and is watching this movie 45 years after it came out, I can't say this is my least favorite vampire movie or least favorite Stephen King adaptation. But when it comes to both kinds of films, I've definitely seen better. It does have occasional atmospheric moments and some cool scares, but overall was a little underwhelming and a little too much of a victim of its time period for me. I am aware that this film got a sequel 8 years after it aired, and that one did get a theatrical release, which hopefully means it's shorter. Okay, good. Here's to hoping the next one is more of what I was looking for this time around. But if you're someone that likes the idea of combining 1970s soap opera aesthetics with retro horror aesthetics, you might want to give this one a bite. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe, and also be sure to check out CineMaine's website, and be on the lookout for future CineMaine content.